In the wake of the Pennsylvania grand jury report, the fallout from the clergy sex abuse crisis continues. The Vatican and many U.S. bishops have responded, and tonight, Bishop Robert Morlino of Madison, Wisconsin is here to share what he believes caused the crisis and the way forward. And later, Catholic League President Bill Donohue will analyze the media response to the scandal in the church. And finally, what is the status of Catholic teaching on capital punishment after the Pope's change to the catechism? Bioethicist Father Tad PACHOLCZYK will tell us. The World Over begins right now.
Now, from Washington, D.C., Raymond Arroyo.
A warm welcome to all of you joining us in the United States and the world over. Bishop Robert Morlino, Bill Donohue, and Father Tad PACHOLCZYK are all straight ahead. If you'd like to comment on tonight's show, send me a tweet. I'm at Raymond Arroyo. I'll be live tweeting throughout. And now some news from the world over. Pope Francis has issued a letter to all the faithful condemning the crime of priestly sexual abuse and its cover-up. He refers to the Pennsylvania grand jury report that alleged that more than 1,000 victims were abused by priests over 70 years. The Pope acknowledged that no effort to beg forgiveness will be sufficient, vowing, quote, never again, and demanding future accountability. Francis blamed clericalism in part for the problem, but he did not propose any specific measures or sanctions for bishops who covered up abuse. Francis will be meeting with abuse victims in Ireland during the World Meeting of Families. And the fallout from the Theodore McCarrick scandal continues to play out in the Archdiocese of Newark. In wide-ranging interviews with EWTN's Catholic news agency, 6 priests shed light on McCarrick's, quote, well-known reputation for having a fondness for handsome seminarians when he was archbishop there, and that within the archdiocese there is a subculture of actively homosexual priests that has existed for at least the past 30 years, according to these witnesses. Fearing reprisals, the priest asked to remain anonymous, including one who worked with McCarrick in the Newark Chancery. Among the McCarrick allegations, he would touch seminarians inappropriately. He would invite young men to stay the night in the cathedral rectory. 3 of the priests reported being invited to sexually charged cocktail parties with other priests in attendance. One said that he was led into the room to a chorus of wolf whistles and that he felt like he was on display. After the published CNA report, Cardinal Archbishop Joseph Tobin seemed to deny any knowledge of a gay subculture among the priests. The Archdiocese released a statement saying, quote, no one, including the anonymous sources cited in the article, has ever spoken to Cardinal Tobin about a gay subculture. Separately, Tobin has instructed priests to no longer speak to the press about the current scandals. Joining me now to offer his insight into the sex abuse crisis and explain his letter to the priests and seminarians and people of his diocese is Bishop Robert Morlino. He joins us from his offices in Madison, Wisconsin. Bishop, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Raymond, and greetings to you, good wishes and prayers, and to all of your viewers. I just want to say at the outset that I do once again apologize to the victims of all the terrible abuse that's been uncovered more recently. And I can't say enough about how I care for the pain that they feel, and that I'm really with them in prayer and with fraternal affection. I hope that I can really help to move things forward so that they will not have to worry that this is going to continue to happen. And that's why I began my letter saying I'm tired of it. So there you are.
Bishop Morlino, as you mentioned, that letter you wrote this past weekend to members of your diocese, in it you address this crisis of sin that we are seeing throughout the church today. And you write, and we'll put it up on the screen, for too long we have diminished the reality of sin. We've refused to call a sin, and we have excused sin in the name of mistaken notion of mercy. There is a certain comfort level with sin that has come to pervade our teaching, our preaching, our decision-making, and our very way of living. If you permit me, what the church needs now is more hatred. And you go on to say, hatred of sin. What does that mean, Your Excellency?
Well, it simply means that the Lord created in us a good deal of different types of psychic energy. And one of those types of psychic energy, Raymond, is hatred. So hatred must be good for something. And it's good for hating evil. It's good for hating evil, never hating evildoers, but it's good for hating evil. It's good for hating the devil. And I'm afraid that a lot of people today don't believe in the devil, and I mean Catholics. And I'm afraid that too often people have excused themselves from sinful behavior by saying, I'm following my conscience, and that's the highest law. And that, of course, has been the linchpin of so many problems since the Vatican Council, because the idea of the supremacy of conscience, plain English, is really against the documents of Vatican II, the Declaration of Religious Freedom. It's right at the beginning, and it's clear as a bell. Conscience does not dispense us from following the teaching of the Church.
Your Excellency, I need to dwell on one part of the letter that has gotten a lot of attention from people around the world who read this letter. You've gotten a lot of press coverage on it. You target and hone in on a subculture within the hierarchy as the main problem, the driving force of the sex abuse crisis that we're watching unfold before us. You write this, but to be clear, in the specific situations at hand, we are talking about deviant, sexual, almost exclusively homosexual acts by clerics. We're also talking about homosexual propositions and abuses against seminarians and young priests by powerful priests, bishops, and cardinals. We are talking about acts and actions which are not only in violation of the sacred promises made by some, in short, sacrilege, but also are in violation of the natural moral law for all. To call it anything else would be deceitful and would only ignore the problem further. Your Excellency, give me your sense of what you were getting at here. Why is that such a big deal today? And why are so few people seeing the problem and the issue the way you are?
Well, there's been a desire on the part of some, since our Dallas Charter was issued, to keep the problem of the abuse, sexual abuse by clerics, to keep it away from homosexuality and move it toward pedophilia. But the statistics belie that. At least 80% of those abused were post-pubescent males being abused by other adult males. Now, that is not pedophilia, it's more properly ephebophilia. It's a kind of homosexuality. There's no question really about that. And when I say hierarchy, there's been some misunderstanding there. I don't just mean bishops, I mean bishops, priests, and deacons. Those who hold the three ranks in the hierarchy. And there have been problems, serious problems at all three levels. And again, it's rooted in this lack of sensitivity to sinfulness. So many Catholics believe either that there is no afterlife or that everybody's going to heaven. And when I go to funerals, I see one canonization after another. And you know, there's no thought of purgatory. It's alleluia, alleluia, period. Well, there's no period. As I say often, I sometimes think that someday I'm going to be in purgatory. St. Peter's going to throw me a key and ask me to lock up after everybody else has left.
Well, save me a spot, please. I want to go on in your letter because you write this. It is time to admit that there is a homosexual subculture within the hierarchy of the Catholic Church that is wreaking great devastation in the vineyard of the Lord. The Church's teaching is clear that the homosexual inclination is not in itself sinful, but it is intrinsically disordered in a way that renders any man stably afflicted by it unfit to be a priest. And the decision to act upon this disordered inclination is a sin so grave that it cries out to heaven for vengeance. Now, some will say, Bishop, reading this letter, that you are blaming homosexuality for the problems in the Church and for the sex abuse crisis. You would say what?
I would say that homosexuality is at the root of this. For reasons that I just explained, Raymond, I don't have any hatred in my heart for homosexuals. I don't have any desire to bash them. But I do owe them respect by speaking the truth. And this is a very difficult area in which to speak the truth, because the minute you speak the truth, you're called a hater. I mean, that's along the lines of some of the mail that I've been getting. But I think it's so very important to keep in mind the hierarchy means priests, bishops, deacons, and that homosexual subculture doesn't mean an institution. It just means situations like having beach houses where certain people come and gather frequently, and illicit behavior, sinful behavior happens there. Well, if that kind of thing is happening, that's an instance of a gay subculture. I think some people think when I say gay subculture that bishops have gotten together and organized this. Well, first of all, if somebody said, do you really believe that, I would say no. And secondly, I don't have any proof that anything like that had happened. So when some bishops are saying, what's this about a subculture? I don't see any subculture. I think they mean they don't see an institution, an organized institution. But that's not what this is. This is something where it's easy to turn and look the other way while certain behavior is engaged.
Do you believe
we've got to stop looking away.
Do you believe that this is primarily in the seminaries, in the seminary formation houses? We're reading reports, which I'll get to in a minute. I mentioned it earlier. In Newark, New Jersey, Catholic News Agency broke this story this week. 6 priests coming forward that claim there has been a homosexual subculture in the seminary there for 30 years. Cardinal Tobin denies that subculture exists.
Well, in terms of the seminaries that I've used, for the sake of complete transparency, we were sending collegians regularly to the college program at Seton Hall, St. Andrew's Hall, as they call it, and of course, I find out that there was a problem there. But I must say that my seminarians and I are in very good contact. And while they were there, I never had anyone speak to me about anything like that. In the college seminary, I don't know anything about the theologate, but in the college seminary, I never had anybody speak a word to me about that. So again, while I want to get the facts out and I want there to be that kind of an investigation, I'm not claiming to have the facts now. So I'm not saying this one should resign, that one should be fired. I'm not in any position to do that.
Now, some would say, Your Excellency, and reading your piece, reading the reaction to it, people say the vow of celibacy should be lifted, or you should let priests marry. Your thoughts on that as a solution to what we're dealing with here?
Well, I think if we look at the state of marriage in the world, where people don't even have a clear idea of what marriage is, I think to say that this is going to be the solution is more than far-fetched. I don't know how it would work. For instance, when we had marriage among the Eastern clergy in Eastern Europe, the role of women in society that kind of allowed for that was very different from the role of women in society that we have now in the United States. And I don't know culturally if that would work, if women would really be willing to enter into that kind of a marriage where she was always considered the priest's helper, because that's how people would look on her. And maybe she'd want to have a life of her own. That wouldn't make things so easy. And then worse than that is the problem of divorce. I don't see any reason to believe that priests are going to have a rate of divorce any lower than any other group. As a matter of fact, it might be higher because they've had so little experience, usually until a higher age. So if priests are going to get divorced, well then, even if they don't remarry or whatever, what are we going? There are a lot of people in parishes who would say, "I don't want a divorced priest." Well, then what?
Yeah.
Is the bishop going to be liable for them, and then also to take care of their family? It would bankrupt the church. It's not very feasible from a practical point of view. And people who say things like that should really think it through a little bit more carefully.
Let's talk for a moment about your suggestion here that, and I have to return to this, it's made most of the news, where you seem to be saying gay men should not be allowed in the priesthood, but there are other clerics who are saying something very different. Cardinal Supich in Chicago had this to say. I'll put this up in an interview. He said, "I really believe that the issue here is more about a culture of clericalism in which some are ordained and they feel they're privileged and therefore protected so that they can do what they want. People, whether heterosexual or homosexual, need to live by the gospel." He added that he would not want to reduce this simply to the fact that there are some priests who are homosexual. I think that is a diversion to get away from the clericalism that's much deeper as a part of this problem. Your reaction to that. Is clericalism the problem?
Well, first of all, I would say that clericalism to me means that the priest is put up on a pedestal, or the bishop is put up on a pedestal, in a few words. That's what it means to me. I haven't seen that. I mean, I know what it was when I was a little boy, and I was growing up, and the priest and the bishop were on a pedestal. Priests today can be treated very poorly in a parish. And I can vouch, I've been a bishop for almost 20 years. I can vouch that the treatment that I receive hardly places me on a pedestal. So that's what I mean by clericalism, and I don't experience it. I don't experience it in my own life. I think the real problem, though, here, in terms of celibacy, is celibacy doesn't only involve physical abstinence. It involves an attitude of mind and heart, an attitude which is a virtue, and that is accepting God's grace to sacrifice the companionship of marriage. When the celibate is abstaining physically, what he's thinking is, my God, the Lord gives me the grace to sacrifice the companionship of marriage. My God. And that brings about a kind of a quasi-mystical sense of the presence of God in one's life. Now, if one is homosexual, one is not attracted to marriage of a woman. That is, one is not attracted to marriage. And if you're not attracted to something, you can't sacrifice it. So even if there is abstinence in the body, the attitude of mind and heart for someone who is genuinely homosexual cannot be present. That is, I'm sacrificing marriage and it hurts.
Yeah.
Meaning marriage to a woman.
No, Cardinal George said years ago, you have to see yourself as a father and as a husband in the natural order, and then because you're supernaturally wedded to the church, and if you can't see yourself that way, then you really are. This is an incompatible lifestyle for you. I want to quickly return to this notion of clericalism, because I hear a lot of it this week, that clericalism is to blame. That's the root of the problem here. Even the Pope in his letter mentions clericalism. It seems to me if clericalism is its own network of protection, where people feel they're little kings and above the law, maybe that's what they're speaking to. But in that sense, I mean, frankly, ambition or the desire for prestige or money, I see that in many, many professions. I don't see people chasing little kids around, or teenagers around with a predisposition to money or power or wealth. Are they missing the mark here? I mean, in some ways, this is a little bit like blaming a drunken collision on the tire suspension. It seems to me we're missing the point of who and what is driving the crisis.
Well, I could only say from my point of view that clericalism, as I experience it, what is called clericalism, has to do with wearing cassocks or having nice vestments at Mass, or wearing the cassock too often, and insisting upon titles and all of this. Some of our seminarians and younger priests want to sacrifice marriage for a clear priestly identity. And they find that cassocks and titles and nice vestments deepen their sense of the otherness of the priesthood, deepen their sense that they are sacred, deepen their sense that they are a mystery to themselves. And that is the kind of spirituality in which they want to be formed. Now, I think to call that clericalism is, again, not to listen to what they're saying.
I want to move on to the remedies for this, Your Excellency. Only the Holy See can investigate and discipline bishops. What should the Bishops' Conference do now? There are some calls to meet before November. Do you think that's a good idea? Warranted?
That's a tough one for me. I don't know, because I don't know if the meeting, when we say before November, our administrative board meets in September. And I don't see that we could really put something together that would be effective before November. And that's part of the problem with our conference. Our conference can do many good things, but one of the things our conference has never been able to do is to act quickly. And when we run into a situation in the church that demands a swift response, the conference is simply not capable. It is too large. It requires a bureaucracy. We can't find fault with how many bishops there are in the United States.
Right.
At least I can't. I mean, that's way above my pay grade. But I think that trying to pull something together that would be effective would probably draw huge amounts of demonstrators. And then if we really weren't well prepared, I think it could make the situation worse. That's my personal opinion. If some others would like to have an earlier meeting, I would certainly do my best to be there.
I want to call your attention to Bishop Egan of Portsmouth in the UK. He's suggesting that the Holy Father convene an extraordinary synod to deal with the life and ministry of clerics and to give some guidance from the Vatican level on all of this. Is that needed now?
Well, I think that would be one approach. And I also think that an approach that would be useful would be to have the Holy Father appoint an apostolic visitator to the United States who could then assemble a team and would have the faculties from the Holy Father to investigate. I think something concrete has to begin. And when I say I don't know if we could pull a meeting together before November, I'm not saying we can't do anything. I mean, this does demand a more immediate response.
Right.
But our conference isn't into immediate responses.
Yeah. Well, the church isn't into immediate responses, which is part of the problem here.
Right.
I mean, the U.S. isn't alone in dealing with this, sex abuse crisis and cover-ups. I mean, we're seeing it in Chile. We're seeing it with Archbishop McCarrick. You're seeing it in Colombia. Here's the question. The Pope set up investigatory protocols in 2016 and a tribunal. He has since dismantled those, and those were constructed to discipline bishops. Do you think perhaps it's time to convene something like that? And why shouldn't McCarrick face the music in Rome?
Well, clearly something has to be done with regard to Cardinal McCarrick. I pray that he and others who have been involved in misconduct or in cover-up, both of which are very seriously sinful, I hope that somehow the Lord can still keep them safe in his providence, whatever that might mean. And I don't wish them any ill. As far as having a special tribunal, I suspect that those who were supposed to set up the tribunal had their reasons for convincing the Pope not to do it or to postpone it. And I don't know what those reasons are. So once again, if I don't have all the facts, I'm stuck.
Yeah. Pope Francis is meeting with victims of sex abuse while he's in Ireland attending the World Meeting of Families. What impact do you think this crisis is having on that meeting, and how might it change the focus of that youth synod in October?
Well, I'm very concerned about both of these situations because if, for example, statements were to come out of the synod which are ambiguous, as some of the statements were that came out of the last two synods, if they're ambiguous, I'm just afraid that it's going to unwittingly contribute to the comfort level with sin. If the ambiguity tends to say there's more latitude here for what we used to call sin. And I really don't think we should go that way. And I suppose, very honestly, if it were simply up to me, and this is my personal opinion, that I would probably have canceled both of those events. I think I would probably have canceled both meetings and then pulled together some of those resources to see what could be done concretely to impact the scandal that we have now.
Before I let you go, I asked Cardinal Burke about this last week. Some have floated to me the idea, and I think it a good one, to have an independent forensic financial audit of every diocese in the United States. The idea being that that would uncover the financial misdeeds which very often lead to the personal and sexual misdeeds. Would you support something like that, and lay involvement being an independent forensic audit?
I would. And we have an independent audit every year. And that audit is always made public. And that audit has uncovered, in fact, some misdeeds, financial misdeeds, that were happening in certain parishes. And you know, yes, I would favor that. I think that without somehow having the key role of the bishop as teacher, sanctifier, and governor, without having those key elements compromised, I think we need as much transparency and as much competent, faith-filled lay involvement as is possible. But the lay involvement has to be competent, and it really has to be faithful. These people have to be people who would be willing to make the profession of faith and take the oath of fidelity to the church. They have to be that. I'm not saying they literally have to do that, but they have to be that kind of person.
Right. Final question. It seems to me your letter identifies that we have a recruitment, a retention, and an advancement problem in the church. How do you cure that? Are there processes, are there watchdogs you can install to make sure that the recruitment of priests, the retention, and the advancement of them up the hierarchical ladder can be protected?
Well, I can only, I am doing that in this diocese. And we're very carefully on the watch. And many other bishops are very carefully on the watch, too. Obviously, some are not as vigilant as they need to be. But here we're doing what we can. And I think this is where maybe as a conference, we could talk about best practices, you know, in those three areas to make sure. But those things are very, very well cared for in this diocese. And as a matter of fact, if there's been advancement, it's been, any significant advancement has been at the initiative of the Holy See.
Very good. Bishop Robert Morlino, I thank you so much for the time. And you can read Bishop Morlino's full letter at madisondiocese.org. Up next, Catholic League President Bill Donahue. But first, this story. Among the official speakers at the World Meeting of Families in Dublin this week was Father James Martin. He is the Jesuit Vatican Media Advisor, an outspoken advocate for the LGBT community. Father Martin told the participants on Thursday that it is a huge step forward for the Church that his talk was allowed at the World Meeting of Families, and further, that his talk was a sign to all Catholics that the Vatican considers LGBT Catholics part of the Church. He told the audience that church and parishes should be more welcoming to active homosexuals and their gifts, and to stop discriminating against them.
So the most important thing that we might be able to do for LGBT Catholics is to welcome them into what is already their church. By excluding LGBT Catholics, the church is falling short of its call to being God's family. By excluding LGBT Catholics, you are breaking up God's family. You are tearing apart the body of Christ.
He added that Francis is the first pope to even use the word gay. Also addressing the World Meeting of Families was embattled Cardinal Oscar Rodriguez Maradiaga, the Pope's top lieutenant with the Council of Cardinals in Rome. He recently condemned a group of seminarians who alleged widespread homosexual behavior at the seminary in the Cardinals' home diocese. He spoke on Pope Francis's revolution of tenderness, as he put it, and opened his talk with what news reports have called Las Vegas-style crooning. It was a song about Pope Francis and the joy of the gospel. It's catchy. Joining me now with his thoughts on the media coverage of the abuse crisis and some other stories of the week is the president of the Catholic League, Dr. Bill Donahue, who joins us from Manhattan. Bill, thanks for being here. Give me your overall critique of this moment, post-McCarrick, post-grand jury report. People are madder than hell, Bill. Your reaction?
Well, I understand why people are livid. They need to be. Otherwise, you're not going to get the kind of reforms that we do need. On the other hand, the twin scandals of the summer of 18, which we will remember for a long time, have to be put in perspective. We're talking about old cases. What McCarrick allegedly did was in the 1980s, most of it. The Pennsylvania grand jury report, the vast majority of the cases before 1990, they go back to World War II. And in every case, just about every case, they never substantiated anything. They never gave a priest an opportunity who was accused to rebut anything. And keep in mind, people, all the priests, and not all of them were priests, by the way. Some were seminarians, some were brothers, some were deacons. But of the priests, they're all either dead or they have been laicized. They are no longer in ministry. So keep in perspective, this is not going on in 2018.
Do you buy the notion, Bill, and we discussed this with Bishop MORLINO earlier, that clericalism is the cause of this crisis? The Pope, Cardinal Tobin, others have mentioned clericalism as the root cause.
You've got two problems here. You've got the enabling bishops, not all of them, just a few, and you've got the predator priest. In the case of the enabling bishop, one could argue that clericalism, a kind of a sense that we know better attitude, certainly played a role. In the case of the molesting priest, almost all of them were homosexuals. So you've got to look at it that way. But one thing we have to be very careful about, Pope Francis, on August the 20th, came out with a wonderful letter, and he warned about clericalism. He included the laity, thank you, the laity. Be very, very careful of some of these lay men and women who now are riding their high horse that they're going to resolve all the problems. They come to the table with their hands clean. Remember, Jesus warned us about the purist, okay? Now, we are not a sinless church, and I'm not excusing anyone. I'm simply saying we live in a time of hyperventilation, of where everything is overheated. And yes, we have to get the guilty, but we must protect the innocent. There are too many priests and bishops who I'm afraid are going to get sundered because someone's going to drop a dime and they're going to say, well, something happened to me. He groped me in 1965 or something. We must protect the rights of the priests and the bishops as well as go after the bad guys.
You know, Bill, I've been covering in the secular realm. You've got actors, you've got actresses, you've got directors charged with sexual malfeasance that turned out to be untrue. It was a scorned lover or it was a bad relationship. This same thing at times happens in the church. But also, Bill, you have to say, there does seem to be a new awareness of this, and the outrage is real because the fallout is real. There are victims out there, and that's why I think things have gotten so overheated. Everybody's heart can go out to these victims, and you really do feel you want justice for them. And if there are malefactors out there today, and there are, they should be brought to justice and they should be removed if they're still in office. Now, you issued a detailed response to the Pennsylvania grand jury report earlier this month. You've taken some heat over it. Some see it as a defense of the indefensible, Bill. Is now the appropriate time, given that feeling that people are going through right now and the hurt and the raw emotions, is now the right time to talk about what might be wrong with this grand jury report?
There's no better time than now. Because if I did that next month, nobody's going to care. I had to get it out right away, to get out in front of it. I don't want falsehoods out there. People are saying this is going on today. Let me tell you something. The reforms issued by the bishops in 2002 are working. Let me give you two quick examples. Everybody knows that Cardinal McCarrick, he's no longer a cardinal. All these allegations against him, there's a lot of evidence there. Okay, let's assume he is guilty, all right? How do we know he's guilty? Do people realize this because Cardinal Dolan turned him in? Do they realize that? They had these strictures in place, the bishops since 2002. Cardinal Dolan has his own independent reconciliation and compensation program. Someone came forward, they investigated, they found it out. Now, that's not too easy for one sitting cardinal to talk to another cardinal and say, listen, we got enough evidence in here, and we've got to go to the authorities about this. The other case is in the Diocese of Allentown, Pennsylvania, just this week. A priest allegedly was involved in groping and doing some other things to a 17-year-old girl. Now, the media say, well, the authorities got a hold of him. Wait a minute. The bishop there in Allentown found out about this in early June. He contacted the authorities. In other words, the system is, in fact, working today. So that's why I say people have to understand. I'm not against reforms. I'm simply saying that the reforms that the bishops made and many of the dioceses are indeed working.
I just want to pick up on something you said about Cardinal McCarrick. Part of the reason we know he's guilty is the Pope stripped him of public ministry. So within the investigatory purview of the Vatican, and Cardinal Dolan's review board was a part of that, they discovered wrongdoing, and he was guilty, at least in the eyes of the church.
Okay.
Now, whether he's criminally found guilty or they moved to that level, that remains to be seen. I want to talk for a moment. You mentioned in your grand jury debunking release that no one was found guilty of anything. No one, Bill?
Right. Almost nobody. Quite frankly, let's put it this way. Nobody got a chance to rebut it. Now, I know of bishops who have written to Shapiro, the Attorney General, and said, what you have here is false. I know of cardinals who have written to him and said, what you've said here is false. Did he bother to take it out? No. If these guys are dead, how in the world can they rebut the claims?
So are you disputing? So you're disputing the facts as laid out by that grand jury report?
Well, I'm saying simply this: they might all be true. They might all be false. Obviously, not most of them are probably not false. I would guess maybe half of them might be true. Why do I say that? Because I've read all these studies, and I've read what they've said about the John Jay study between 1950 and 2002. They said 4% of the priests in this country had a credible accusation made against them, but only 2% of them were ever substantiated. So they're saying 300 priests, not all of them are priests. I'm thinking the figure might be closer to 150, but we'll never know. Remember, a grand jury report is not factual. Unlike this guy who works at the Weekly Standard, Andrew Ferguson, he says they're factual. What? No grand jury report is factual. And the old adage is you could prosecute and indict a ham sandwich. This is hearsay. A lot of it is true, but none of it is rebuttable. It's one-sided. That's why it's not evidentiary.
Attorney General Shapiro in Pennsylvania claims that, quote, almost every instance of child abuse found was too old to be prosecuted. But, Bill, it happened. I mean, a lot of this did happen. And, you know, we wouldn't have any of this if not for the grand jury report.
Right, right. But I want to compare apples with apples. What percent, for example, of the abusers, will Shapiro ever go after the public schools? Why are we being set up? This is cherry picking. Let me give you a quick example here. Let's say you did a study of street crime, and you found out that non-whites were disproportionately represented, and that's all you talked about. Then you conclude that there must be something congenitally wrong about blacks and Hispanics because they're involved in a lot of crime. Well, there is such a thing called white-collar crime, isn't there, on Wall Street? Doesn't it take place in lawyers' offices, white-collar people in the corporate world? If you don't look at that and make that comparison, you would assume wrongly that people of color are somehow a bunch of criminals. There's an awful lot of white people walking around, very rich people, who are criminals too. I want to see justice be done across the board. I think it's a mistake for the bishops to open up their books to anybody unless one condition is met. You tell me, Attorney General, you tell me, District Attorney, that you're not just going to cherry pick the Catholic Church, that you're also going to demand that the public schools and the Jewish schools and the Protestant schools and everybody else will open up their books, and then we'll do so. Otherwise, we are subverting the church in the name of justice.
Should the statute of limitations be lifted to prosecute some of these cases, as the grand jury has suggested here, Bill?
They don't. Listen, we have been lied to by Shapiro and by Mike Rossi. He's the one pushing it. When I say they're lied to, I know this stuff. I live this stuff every day. Every bill that Rossi and that Shapiro's endorsed doesn't cover the public schools. And unless you explicitly cover the public schools, they are protected by what's called the doctrine of sovereign immunity. That means you have 90 days to file a claim. You don't have. So if you want to suspend the statute of limitations, fine. I pushed for that in New York, pushed for the public schools. Guess what happened in 2009? She's no longer an assemblywoman. Margaret Markey said, okay, we'll include the public schools. Guess who went bonkers? The teachers' unions, the school superintendents, the principals. They said, you can't go back. The reason why we have statutes of limitation is because most of the witnesses are either dead or their memories are faded. So I am for equal justice before the law. I don't think any bishop should ever cooperate with any law enforcement unless, in fact, the same playing field is being invoked against everybody else in the public and in the private sector.
Well, the bishops are already pledging to work with law enforcement. I mean, you mentioned a moment ago a bishop who turned over a malefactor. Don't you think that's a good idea?
No, I don't think it's a good idea. You don't ever make public the accused. You go forward with the convicted. No, I do want to know the names of the convicted. This Bishop Accountability has the names of priests up there who were accused and then found innocent. Their names are still up there by Bishop Accountability. I wouldn't trust them. The head of Bishop Accountability, Terence McKiernan, said a few years ago that Cardinal Dolan was hiding 55 priests. I've contacted him several times. I said, please, give me the names of the 55 priests whom Dolan is protecting. He's never answered me. What I'm saying is that an awful lot of people are lying. You've got truths, you've got half-truths, and you've got out-and-out lies. The Catholics have to be very careful about how they filter these things. But yes, get the bad guys, absolutely.
We saw an outgrowth of this report this week, an act of violence against a priest in Indiana, a Byzantine Catholic priest. He was beaten before Mass. The abusers who came into the sacristy said, "This is for all the kids," they yelled at him. Do you fear more violence like this? And what is the answer here, Bill?
Well, I've certainly gotten my share of threats, I'll tell you that. And all I can tell you is this. The person responsible, obviously, is the assailant. But secondary responsibility, or at least tertiary, has to go to those people who are the Catholic haters. I'm talking about the Catholic suing lawyers and the Catholic hating activists.
Do you not believe that there is a network, a subculture at these seminaries that are actively promoting the kind of behavior that we're seeing play out in these reports, whether they be of ancient pedigree or not?
Well, we know that Father Richard McBrien, a man of the left, said there's a homosexual subculture. Father Cousins, a man of the left, says there's a homosexual subculture. Father Andrew Greeley, a man of the left, called it the Lavender Mafia. We have problems in Boston. We have problems in France. We have problems in Honduras. Let's not worry about World War II. I want to find out what's going on in the seminaries today. Why, if there is a homosexual subculture that's still going on, and no doubt there is, it's going on in Rome. We all know what's going on in Rome. It's not just the United States. We also have to be careful here. I don't want an attack on all gay priests. People might be surprised to hear that. I want to get the people who are guilty, not the ones who are innocent. But of course there's a subculture, and that has to be busted.
Bill Donohue, thank you for being here. You can follow Bill's work at thecatholicleague.org. A few weeks ago, Pope Francis made news by altering age-old church teaching on the death penalty. What has been the Church's understanding of the morality of capital punishment, and what will be the net effect of those changes? Joining me to discuss this and a few other stories is neuroscientist and director of education at the National Catholic Bioethics Center, Father Tad PACHOLCZYK. I sat down with him recently here in D.C. Take a look. Father Tad, several weeks ago, the Holy Father changed the teaching on capital punishment. I want to put on the screen what that looks like. Get your reaction to this. Recourse to the death penalty on the part of legitimate authority following a fair trial was long considered an appropriate response to the gravity of certain crimes and an acceptable, albeit extreme, means of safeguarding the common good. Today, however, and here's the addition, there is an increasing awareness that the dignity of the person is not lost even after the commission of very serious crimes. More effective systems of detention have been developed which ensure the due protection of citizens, but at the same time do not definitively deprive the guilty of the possibility of redemption. The death penalty is inadmissible because it is an attack on the inviolability and dignity of the person. Your thoughts on this change, and ethically, what was the teaching before, and is this new teaching just as ethical?
All right, I would say this is definitely a change, but what it amounts to, in essence, is a change of emphasis. So, you know, in other words, I think here what we're looking at is a development of pastoral practice rather than a development of doctrine.
Ah, so you don't think the Pope has changed doctrine?
No.
You don't see this as a break with doctrine?
No, not a break with doctrine. It is a offered prudential judgment on the part of the Holy Father regarding the question of circumstances. And circumstances, he's saying, look, I'm going to provide you with what is a reasonable read of the current state of affairs in the world and why we as Catholics should not support this. So that's what I see him doing, is saying, I'm going to lay this out for you. And I do think that in general, even when a pope does that, there should be a general sense of us wanting to obey as a first instinct that judgment that is being made.
Even, do you believe that he's saying it's intrinsically immoral in all cases to do this?
No.
He's not invalidating the death penalty. He's just saying, not unlike John Paul, that there are almost no circumstances where it's necessary.
Precisely. And really, he's going so far as to almost say, I really believe there's no circumstances.
Well, some people have said he's already done that.
Yeah, it seems like that's where he's drawing his line. But it is a clear drawing of a line. It's a clear making of a judgment of prudence. And so he'll say, for example, that we have a good system of incarceration. You can have people in jail for a long time.
Europeans and Americans have a good system.
They do, of course. And you
can't say that for a village in China or
in Africa.
Or in Africa.
Listen, I agree. There's going to be all kinds of tribal, conflicts. Going to be situations where you don't have the ability to do this potentially. But I think he's making a read and saying, this is how it looks to me, the direction is heading, and I'm going to offer this as a revision here to the catechism. 75
laymen, churchmen, clergy, as well as lay scholars have signed a petition asking the Cardinals to implore the Pope to restore the original teaching. I'll put up what they are writing. They say, since the present Roman pontiff has now more than once publicly manifested his refusal to teach this doctrine and has rather brought great confusion upon the Church by seeming to contradict it, we hereby call upon your eminences to advise His Holiness that it is his duty to put an end to this scandal, to withdraw this paragraph from the Catechism, and to teach the Word of God unadulterated. Do they have grounds to challenge the Pope like that?
Well, it seems to me that they're clearly recognizing a lack of clarity in terms of the direct continuity with the preceding tradition. And they're saying, in virtue of this, we would like greater clarity. Now, I think this lack of clarity has occurred in other contexts as well, and there's a sense in which, of course, we would all like to have it absolutely clear. But, there was a commentary that was released by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith prior to the actual
release of the catechism.
And it made it very clear that this is not a break with the tradition or a new teaching, but that it was consonant with that preceding tradition.
I feel like we're living through a Morris Laetitia all over again, where, that wasn't a break with the tradition, but it's a break in practice. So if it's a break in practice, isn't that a break with the tradition?
Well,
where do you draw the line? And we've told Catholics for generations, if you have a question, go to the Catechism. Now the Catechism is saying something it didn't say yesterday. Well, is that a change or it's not a change?
I mean, it's a change, but this Pope, we have to understand, is so pastorally minded that a lot of times this becomes kind of the central focus of what he does, and it sort of obliterates then the possibility of further discourse around substantive doctrinal issues, which in a sense to him are just not in his purview as he's focused on those pastoral details. So that's how I really think this has to be framed. It can't be framed as a genuine break with what has preceded. It is clearly a judgment that he is offering of his own assessment.
I think it's hard for the laity to understand that when they read a catechism.
Yes.
Because the catechism is where they go to get doctrinal reinforcement and clarity.
And notice he uses a word, though, that, I think for people it's a new word, this word inadmissible.
Right.
He doesn't say it's intrinsically wrong. He doesn't use language that would traditionally declare this to be always
or intrinsically evil.
Intrinsically evil. He doesn't do that. He says it's inadmissible. What does that mean? Well, inadmissible is almost a legal term. It's a term we would say if you failed to sign the contract in the signature line, then the contract is inadmissible. Or what about if you say something like this, that it's inadmissible in the Catholic tradition to charge 35% interest rates on a credit card. That would be usury. So it's inadmissible, but it doesn't mean that sometimes you might not have grounds for charging 35% interest that would be morally defensible.
You have been
All right,
preaching. I want to change topics for a moment.
All right.
You've been traveling the country, preaching and teaching about Humanae Vitae, which is Paul VI's landmark encyclical. It is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year. What has been the reception as you go about the country? And given what we're seeing with this sex abuse crisis, where did we go wrong, and what might Humanae Vitae have to still teach us?
Well, I think we have a clear crisis of understanding of the Church's sexual teachings, and we've had this for a long time. And I think when you talk about among Catholics in general, and perhaps from the point of view of those who are charged with preaching and sharing the fullness of the message, that there are many ways in which there have been deficits and failures. And that has potentially played out then in the direction that the scandal has gone. I mean, people said, well, in 2002 it was addressed. Now we see it coming back in a new and perhaps greater firestorm, because the realization that this has roots that extend then the whole branches all the way up to the top. And so there clearly is, I think, an issue here of not teaching what the Church has clearly articulated. Now, there's a component of Catholics who recognize this. You ask about my traveling around the country, is there receptivity? Definitely. People want to hear this message. They want their pastors to share it and preach it. And when they hear it in its fullness, they accept it. There's an openness to it.
Yeah.
So it's just that I think we're in a place where people have a fear of preaching this in its fullness. And part of the consequence of that is that they themselves may be in compromised situations. And, you know, this has come out in some of these scandals.
The country's saying that doctors may be permitted to end the lives of dementia patients. What is going on here?
Yeah, this is remarkable. This is a kind of expansion of powers that seems to be occurring in Great Britain. General practitioners there are being told, look, if you have dementia, if you have somebody who's in a coma, somebody maybe who's had a stroke, other mental issues, well, sure, they could live a long time if they're on a feeding tube, but you may be able to convene a best interests committee and discuss what is in the best interests of this patient and argue and hold to a position that you can withdraw the feeding tube so as to cause the death by starvation and dehydration. It's very interesting, Raymond, that the push for this, they also say, if this is done, very important that you not notate on the death certificate that the person died from starvation and dehydration. You have to list whatever else was going on, the dementia, but don't mention that. So already you see there's a problem.
The hiding the euthanasia.
Putting it under the rug.
I want to read this. This is a statement of the British Medical Association. What they're proposing, it reads like this. Due to the degenerative nature of their condition, these patients are on an expected downward trajectory and will invariably die, usually as a result of their underlying condition, although perhaps not imminently, and could potentially go on living for many years. Well, Father, you and I are on a downward trajectory. I mean, everybody's on a downward trajectory. Does this language concern you?
It certainly does. It's a language that is imprecise, and it's a language that fails also to recognize that, of course, there will be situations where removing feeding tubes may make sense when you're dealing with a situation where a person has a few hours left or where there are complications that arise. But none of that nuance is part of this.
Wow.
It's just, look, people, their lives, the quality of life.
They're going to die anyway.
Yeah, it's going downhill here. Let's just kind of start pulling things out as long as we get kind of consensus among a few who are caregivers.
How related might this be, before we move on, to standardized care and universal health care that's offered in Great Britain?
I suspect there are connections there. I think when this one figure that gets repeated a lot is that most of the expenses that are put out for somebody during their lifetime, medical expenses, happen at the end. And they'll say even, you know, the final months. But look, that's the kind of system we need to structure so that we get proper care at the end and we support people. We don't abandon them.
Father Ted PACHOLCZYK, thank you for the insight as always. We'll check in with you soon.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That is all the time we have for now. Until next week, the show continues on Facebook and Twitter. You can like me on Facebook, follow me on Twitter. The links are at raymondarroyo.com. Be sure to join us next week. Until then, we'll be scouting the world over for all that is seen and unseen. On behalf of the staff and crew of EWTN News, thanks for watching. I'm Raymond Arroyo from Washington, D.C. Bye now.